Hey, Luke, I was thinking, last year when you said maybe I should mix up the way that you introduce me as well as Tennant, and I was like, no, you could just stick with my global VP for marketing and extortion. I feel like I'm generally terrible at improvising, but that could be funny. So anyway, not for today, but maybe future pods.
I have been wondering how long I can keep the shtick up, thinking of new ways of introducing Tennant.
I've got to keep revealing more onion-like layers to my persona.
Well, you're a man of multitudes. Episode 21, I'm starting to run out of material.
That's a pretty big onion.
We shall see. I always go, oh, what on earth am I going to say today? And then I always come up with something. So yes, we could swap it. I could come up with random things to say about you.
I'm not really sure that's a wise thing.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion of the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Hello, lovely gents. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land this evening. Thanks, Luke.
And a man who recently took up the role of Creative Director for the Let Me Sum Up podcast's T-shirt division, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I was a strong contender in a volunteer field of one.
To be fair, you didn't actually consult us before you took on that role.
Well, the muse commanded me.
But some of the early results have been delightful.
Yes, so at some point listeners might get a chance to have a look at some bad T-shirt designs from me, but the Die Hard to Die Harder based Safeguard to Safeguarder T-shirt I think is a strong contender for first T-shirt.
Tennant, do you know that Luke's been whipping that out to show to random people when I've been in meetings with him?
I've been doing market testing for you, Tennant, and I can tell you that the summer operas that I run into on a daily basis are pretty enthusiastic.
Count at least 5 people that would buy that T-shirt, Tennant.
Right. Well, that's my retirement fund right there.
All right, well, Frankie and Tennant, to accommodate some travel, we are recording early, so if our summer operas are waiting on us to comment on any consequential developments in energy and climate policy, we probably don't know about them yet, so that is why we're not addressing them, but luckily there isn't much going on at the moment, so we should be okay.
We could just utter several things that might have happened, and then Luke, you can subsequently edit them out. That sounds like exactly how you would like to spend a couple of evenings this coming week.
I like ever more complex edits of this podcast, so thank you for that. On this week's show, we take on the Productivity Commission's latest musings on how Australia can sharpen up its climate policies. But first, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has released AR6, the synthesis of 3 previous IPCC reports, described as a survival guide for humanity by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who went out of his way to underline the urgency of the emissions reduction task facing humanity. Frankie, there isn't a lot of good news in here, but what did you make of it?
I mean, as you say, this report draws together the 3 previous reports that were published over a period starting from late 2021 through to April last year in 2022. So it covers the sort of physical science of the climate crisis, including observations and projections for global heating. It also looked at the impacts of the climate crisis and how to adapt to them, and then lastly, ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which I think was the subject of the most recent report, and we commented on that, I believe, in this podcast.
Our very first episode.
Yes. And so this report is significant because, as you say, it's the final instalment of that sixth assessment report, and the next one's probably not due to be released until very late in the decade, like at least sort of 2027, and possibly because they take years to pull together. This is really the last complete report that we'll see from the IPCC before we're meant to have completed the critical decade out to 2030. So it's especially significant in the regard that this is the last kind of big formal call for what that emissions abatement task needs to look like to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so whilst there aren't new findings in this report, because as it suggests, it's a synthesis of all the other ones that have come together, I think taken as a collective, the findings all presented together are very powerful. And so, as you say, Luke, it suggests that this is really the last opportunity, given there's 7 years left in this critical decade, to decarbonise rapidly and across the board, right? So this is saying immediate and deep emissions reduction needs to happen, across all sectors of the economy. And maybe just for some numbers, if we're still wanting to hit that 1.5 degree target, which is seeming ever elusive, and this is saying that it's going to be incredibly difficult to reach that, and there's a rapidly closing window on us getting there. It's going to require at least a 43% emissions reduction on 2019 levels by 2030, a 60% reduction by 2035, and I think close to 70% by 2040.
And net zero CO2 around 2050 and net zero greenhouse gases of all sorts by 2070 or thereabouts.
Yep.
Which is big.
It is big, and I know I'm just sort of was drawn to a little bit of the commentary around negative emissions in this as well, given our recent dalliance with carbon removal technologies. I think just what's so powerful about these reports is it's really starting to contrast the opportunity cost of not moving, further and faster in the near term compared to what we're possibly setting ourselves up for closer to that mid-century point where we might need to be relying on a lot more of those technologies.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's so much in this synthesis because it is synthesising thousands of pages of constituent reports. But the issue of overshoot, that the vast bulk of the assessable scenarios that achieve 1.5 degrees of net warming by the end of this century do so via overshooting the temperature goal for a period and coming back down through negative emissions, net negative global emissions. They do take some time to put that concept out there more clearly, and it's one that I think people are going to have to really come to terms with because it implies some very dangerous things around the climate impacts beyond 1.5 degrees that we'll experience for a while, even if we ultimately get back down to 1.5. But also it implies all those massive investments in negative emissions technologies that are needed to make an overshoot work and not just be missing the target forever.
Yeah. The thing that I've been grappling with, particularly reading a lot of the news reports around the release of this report, and the Secretary-General's language was incredibly forceful. It was a repeat of some of the framing that he was using at COP last year. Phrases like ticking time bomb and final warning that he and others are using. I recognise that it's designed to galvanise ambitious action, and I absolutely understand its intent. I'm incredibly sympathetic to it. However, anyone that's not following these issues closely could draw the conclusion that if we don't succeed in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, if we don't take those very hard decisions over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that we're over the precipice and we might as well just enjoy the journey down. Whereas, in fact, one of the key messages of the report is almost exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
It's that there is a huge difference between 2.5 degrees and 3 degrees and 4 degrees of warming, and those incremental differences really matter in terms of impacts on humans right around the planet. So there's this great tension in which, you know, there is this imperative to galvanise immediate action and to galvanise ambitious action, but the public communications task needs to engage with both of those things simultaneously. We need to make every effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but if we don't hit the next target is not 2.5 or 3 or giving up, it's 1.6.
Yeah.
We need to redouble our efforts because every increment matters a lot.
So, I mean, just sort of to your point, it's very easy to throw around numbers like 3.5 and 4 degrees. But as you say, they represent vastly and increasingly scary different potential futures for the planet and all of the living things on it. And we're not too good at talking about what those futures look like. And then perhaps converting that to the argument for why there's such a strong imperative and why they keep calling it a final warning for us to invest early to avoid, one, the significant chance that this thing doesn't run away from us. Because the other thing this report says is that those climatic and non-climatic risks increasingly interact, like, you know, like the and creating sort of compounding and cascading risks that are, well, yeah, much more complex and very hard for, dare I say it, limited and faulty models like IAMs to deal with, let alone our own understanding of what certain tipping points mean once, you know, sort of crossed.
Well, on that cheery note, shall we talk about a report? Because I understand the Productivity Commission has all the answers.
Well, after this complex and worrying survey of the state of global knowledge, yes, let's get some easy answers.
In March 2023, the Productivity Commission released its latest opus, Advancing Prosperity, a 9-volume epic looking at how we can improve key planks of the Australian economy, including our tax system, innovation policy, industrial relations and our education system. But we'll leave all that to other podcasts to sum up, as it is Volume 6, Managing the Climate Transition, which is squarely in our wheelhouse. In it, the Commission shares its top tips for strengthening and simplifying Australian climate policies while ensuring that they are not a drag on productivity. Tennant, this chapter is overflowing with ideas, but are they good ones?
So, some of them are good, but they're often good in spite of the reasons offered and the arguments offered in favour of them. I found, at least. So a couple of episodes ago, I was on a little bit of a rant about the recommendations here about the safeguard mechanism. There's a lot more here than just PC advice on the design of the safeguard mechanism. They're having a think about climate change as a whole, or, well, a bit of it as a whole. They're having a think about adaptation to climate change and the whole sweep of policy towards mitigation of climate change. And they're trying to advance a worldview of what this response is all about. And so there's a lot to unpack in all of that. Like, I think that their overall argument is that climate change is very significant for productivity. Again, their focus in their whole big 9-volume epic is what can be done to advance Australia's productivity and thereby its prosperity. So, you know, there's a not really their fault focus on the productivity relevant bits of climate change and climate policy. But their overall vision is We've had some difficult politics about carbon pricing, and as a result, we've wound up with a hodgepodge of narrow measures that involve very high shadow carbon prices, and we would be better off going back to the vision of one big economy-wide carbon price to anchor everything else. And while we're doing that, we can eliminate anything that isn't complementary to that in terms of mitigation. And then on the adaptation side, there's all these risks from climate change, and they do a reasonable survey of the risks from climate change. It's not quite a substitute for the IPCC synthesis report, but, they're recognising the fact that people might be experiencing, will be experiencing wet bulb days of extreme temperatures, which will make it dangerous or fatal to be outside without protection, among other things. This has implication for the productivity of the construction sector. And, the other things are pretty important, but it's good for the PC to be recognising that there are these impacts on economic stuff that is easy for them to see is a problem. So they've also got some thoughts on how to do adaptation better, although they're pretty limited thoughts. Frankie, before we get into all the mitigation stuff, should we deal with adaptation, which often gets short shrift and does here, I fear?
It definitely gets short shrift in this report. But before I criticise the narrowness of the scope of recommendations they put forward, I do think they take a bit of time up front to talk about, as you say, the industries that are going to be directly impacted by global warming. They talk about agriculture, fisheries. You only had to look at the IPCC report to see the drop-off in fish yields in marine ecosystems around the country to know that, that industry is staring down the barrel, of a much reduced capacity. Tourism. And, as you say, sectors that sort of rely on the exertion of physical labour in heat-exposed settings, obviously most acutely outdoors. But then it doesn't have much to say about anything to do about that in terms of an adaptation perspective. What it does focus on more acutely, I think, and maybe I sort of took more of an interest into it, was around the built environment in our cities. And it's referenced in a paper that I'd be curious to go have a look at. I think it was Mallon et al. In 2019 that looked at the degree of climate risk, and they identified a few sort of natural disasters or risks to look at, like riverine flooding, coastal inundation, bushfire, subsidence and wind, facing 15 million addresses across 540-odd local government areas, based on a whole bunch of things like topography, biomass coverage, weather patterns, climate projections. And they classified that, just under 400,000 of those addresses would be deemed as high risk, and that number would be projected to increase to over 700,000. So, all that's to say, and things that we know are true, are that, existing buildings, that many of which have been built a really long time ago with no reference to the kind of risks that we're looking at moving forward, are going to be particularly exposed to these risks. I thought where they were a bit light on, and I think perhaps they really oversimplified the task of how you go about addressing this in a meaningful way.
You just need a website and an app, don't you?
All you need to do is to tell people what they're in for.
Yep.
By mandating, mandatory disclosure, could be at the point of sale or lease or whatever that looks like, of the climate-related risks facing a property. And then it's up to the buyers to make an informed decision. And so whilst I think that idea is a good one. I think more information provided to prospective purchasers of property ought to know what risks are involved. Like, that in and of itself is not a substantial policy response to dealing with the adaptation needed in the built environment. And all I would point, dear summer uppers, to is previous reports from the Productivity Commission, which had a lot more things to say about ways that you could make some more sort of structural changes to look at adaptation in those settings, particularly like how you upgrade building codes over time to think about coping with these risks. Before I sort of finish my rant, I do think one of the concepts that they touch on in this report but don't expand on, that is very, very, very important for us, and not just in the building space, but more generally to think about, is this idea of acceptable risk. In the example it's given, like whether new developments should be allowed to go ahead in areas that are exposed to future climate impacts, is like ultimately a question of acceptable risk, and that concept is relevant at lots of different scales. So at the moment, for example, the standards that we use in our building code to build to fire safety standards, all those sorts of things, are designed, are sort of imposed in such a way as to keep the building together long enough for a person to evacuate safely and stay alive. It's not so much about the preservation of the structure itself. And I think what needs to be grappled with in the coming decades, we need to decide whether sort of that's the level of acceptable risk we're willing to go with. Just the provision of, shelter or whatever other policy response we're thinking of to keep a person alive for a certain period of time before they can get somewhere else, or that we're wanting to invest more in making, the infrastructure of the building sufficiently resilient to those natural disaster risks such that it remains and doesn't need to be, rebuilt after the fact, of a disaster or something like that. There's no, I'm sorry, this is a very boring kind of regulatory question that needs to be grappled with, but it's really important because it underpins the way we build stuff in this country. And in the face of, increasing climate risks over time, that idea of how much risk are you willing to accept becomes very relevant when you think about the implications for the provision of finance and insurance over those assets as well.
And they don't really grapple with the uncertainty about how much climate change we're going to have to deal with. Like, what's an acceptable risk for building if you're expecting a 1.5 degrees world? Will not set you up for success in a 2 degrees or a 3 degrees or, God help us, a 4 degrees world, which we can't exclude the possibility of. I know there's this whole debate about RCP 8.5 is rubbish or whatever, but we do face a spectrum of risks, and it's hard to just, tell people, check the CSIRO website and it will say something about all these scenarios, and then go for your life. Like, in their recs, that's it. Other than don't let governments bugger it up by doing dumb things.
For our listeners, this whole section opens with a shout out to CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology for their State of the Climate report, because that's doing a good job of informing the market about these risks.
Yeah.
Whilst we love the CSIRO and the
I'm
BOM
not criticising the CSIRO or the Bureau of Meteorology. I just don't think that the State of the Climate report is in any way, shape or form a broad-based public communications campaign about the risk of climate.
Well, I really took objection to that oversimplification of just look at the climate projections and, all the disclosure regimes we want to put in place around climate risk just need to be based on those projections. Well, projections of which particular scenario? And the thing is, and it goes back to that idea of acceptable risk, the way you might build something is going to look very different for, a 2-degree future versus a 4-degree future, if, depending on where you draw the line at the kind of risk you're willing to accept. So, look, this report really doesn't engage in any of that nuance or complexity.
And it seems like their main... we should move on from adaptation, as important as it is, but it seems like their main adaptation strategy... It's not quite articulated this way, but it seems to be the implication of everything they consider, is that adaptation is largely lightly managed retreat from places that won't be safe or economic to live in anymore. And that could be a coherent view that retreat is a major part of it. Although it would have been nice to hear them talk about building codes and occupational health and safety and performance requirements for new infrastructure and migration and agricultural productivity and emergency services capacity and a lot of other things. But retreat is a controversial concept and one that would maybe stand to have a bit more thought and discussion, even if it winds up being the most rational thing to do for a bunch of places. Boy, there's a lot to unpack there.
And the whole focus of their section on that whole concept of managed retreat is really around making sure that government doesn't waste money along the way.
They hate the Northern Australia reinsurance pool, and maybe they're right to, but...
Yeah.
I don't disagree with suggesting that those kind of schemes should have a long horizon or longevity. It is, in effect, transferring cost, and perhaps, as they sort of say, it's not wrong to note that government intervention through subsidies, grants, or whatever can prolong hard decisions about
100%.
The relocation of communities and adaptation of key infrastructure. They're not wrong about that. I think, just to your point though, because this is so narrowly focused, and relocation of entire communities is much more complex than the sum total of a government cost-benefit analysis.
I mean, the principles that they lay out in terms of how government should think about, whether to apply funds to these sorts of things, it would be very sensible things for a bureaucrat to consider. Will this investment in infrastructure like a seawall or something mitigate against one risk, but there's all these other risks that, are material and will ultimately mean that, that community is unsustainable? That is a good thing to consider, right? Where the infrastructure investment inadvertently encourages excessive risk-taking, where you bite behind your seawall, so, that actually encourages overdevelopment because people feel too safe. These are good things to consider. It's a example of the attitude this whole report takes, which I really bounced off, which is the primary lens we're looking at this through is the effective dispensation of taxpayers' money and the productivity enhancing pathway, and all of the surrounding sort of the political economy, the building of consensus, these incredibly hard conversations that one would need to have if you were going to do that managed retreat, if you were going to have that hard conversation with the community, say, look, it is actually not sustainable for you to stay here and you all need to move. It's just absent. And because of that absence, what is left on the page just seems very cold-blooded.
Were you both glad or sad that they didn't engage more with the question of how ambitious on climate mitigation to be? They just take the national 2030 target of 43% below 2005 and the net zero by 2050. They take them as givens. They don't say they're bad. They don't say they're good. They just say this is what the government's adopted and we're considering policy towards that. Do you think that they would have been better to grapple with how much to avoid a bit more, or would you be frightened of how poorly they would do on that question? Like, they'd be very Nordhausy, I fear.
Okay, so there was one line in this report that I really seized on because it got my goat, and then I read the sentence that followed it. But it was, abatement measures will generally increase the direct costs of production and thereby weigh on measured productivity growth. And when I stopped there, I was like, well, that's only true if you're not considering the opportunity cost of not doing anything about the problem, and presumably will be facing much, much higher cost down the line and impacts on production. So,
you know what's a real break on productivity, Frankie? Catastrophic climate change.
Exactly. So, there's this kind of qualifying thing that comes after it, which is productivity impacts of higher production costs could be viewed as the price of reducing the chance of even greater related climate productivity costs in the future. And I'm like, if you started this report, and I thought they had made a very general reference up front to the IPCC, but I could be confusing things. I didn't like that, because that to me implied that they perhaps hadn't looked very closely at the bargain you're potentially making by delaying or not seeking to maximise near-term ambition, for the sake of having to bear some more of that cost down the line. So from a productivity perspective, I would have thought they'd be more inclined to be pushing the IPCC's consensus view that stronger action earlier would be a better story for productivity in the long run.
Based on the evidence here, Tennant, I don't know that the Productivity Commission is really the organisation that is best placed to provide advice on that front.
I think you're right. But thinking about the questions might have been helpful in compensating for some of the other, or avoiding some of the other paths that thought goes down. Because they're very focused. Let's get to mitigation now. They're very focused on the fear that we might do too much on climate change. By which I mean that we might do the more expensive things as they assess them that might need to be done, that we might do those things too early, that we should do, we should stack up all the abatement opportunities as we see them now, and we should do just the cheapest set of things needed to achieve our short-term targets, and then just gradually move up the cost curve to more expensive things as and when it becomes necessary to achieve incrementally greater mitigation targets. And, later on, technology will have made some things cheaper, but if not, there's always negative emissions technologies structured as offsets.
It does seem to, though, fly in the face of all the other work that we've spent time talking about on this pod.
Yes, it does.
Which suggests that the way you bring the cost of those other interventions down is by doing stuff about it, and by rolling out said technology to put them on those learning rate curves. And this seems to think that will magically happen in the background whilst we fiddle away at other things.
Frankie, would you be referring to winner of the inaugural wonky award for best climate and energy paper?
Wonky. It could be.
Empirically grounded technology forecasts in the energy transition, which we covered back on episode 11, which makes the points that the way that you drive down costs is to deploy things that are expensive, because when you deploy them, they get less expensive. Have I summed that paper up effectively, team?
We didn't need the whole episode. Thanks, Luke.
Nonetheless, dear listener, if you haven't listened to that one, do go back, because there's a lot of great stuff in there, even if it's longer.
I find that we're constantly revisiting that paper.
It's pretty important.
It's got such broad relevance to all the things we talk about, because so much of the current kind of policy settings we find ourselves talking about ignore that reality or make assumptions that those technologies are going to cost more than the historical evidence would suggest.
Yeah, so it's important to say that I actually agree with the Productivity Commission that it would be very helpful if there was something akin to an economy-wide carbon price that would drive a lot of activity and decision-making that it's very hard to deal with sectoral or technology-focused policies. But I think it's also simultaneously the case that targeted focused policy on some critical cornerstone technologies and practices and driving certain types of behaviour is a very effective complement. And the strong impression I get from the Productivity Commission is that they don't think that. Yeah. They think that we should just wait for other people to do stuff, for technology costs to come down, and then we'll just import it later or something.
And they do cite a number of overseas policies that are driving things like bans on internal combustion engine vehicles. They refer to policies overseas and here for supporting renewable energy. They don't explicitly say this, but I cannot escape the conclusion that if the Productivity Commission were in charge of all those countries, or at least had a responsibility to advise all those countries, they would be saying, wrong way, go back, don't do any of those policies, only do an economy-wide carbon price and maybe a very narrow version of complementary policies, which are only those that address a market failure other than the one addressed by carbon pricing, or that have some other social benefit beyond abatement.
They're kind of suggesting that in the case of EVs, because they do make a really big point of stepping out.
They really hate the EV subsidies.
They hate policies that are designed to stimulate demand for EVs. Yes. And it's not, it's not wrong of them to point out, they've done modelling and, just to show that the shadow or implicit carbon price attached to those policies is very expensive.
I didn't like their numbers. I didn't like them one bit.
Not well.
But go on.
But they're also seemingly they're just suggesting we should ride on the coattail of other countries. The EU as a region has an ETS, but they also have vehicle emission standards, which are presumably doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of the phase out of internal combustion engines in those markets.
PC don't mind, as I read it, efficiency standards for Australia. They also don't have more than half a sentence to say about it.
Can I just say, before we move on, that there is a specific statement in this volume, Managing the Climate Transition, that is just flat out wrong. They state that there are these alternative policies that have been pursued because of experience with explicit carbon pricing. Like we had a carbon price and everybody decided they hated it and so we got rid of it. And so we started to pursue renewable energy targets, feed-in tariffs and energy efficiency trading schemes, which is wrong. They all existed before there was an explicit carbon price, and they existed after there was an explicit carbon price, and thank God they did.
They were more politically durable.
They
had charismatic abatement technologies, according to the PC, the equivalent of charismatic megafauna that shallow, faddish, Instagram probably consuming people. And it's good to know, Luke, that somebody thinks that energy efficiency is a glamorous technology.
Well, that was news to me as well. Happy to take it.
And then people have just been distracted by this glittery stuff from the hard yards of doing least cost abatement. That's their view of it.
Mm.
Yeah. It's quite dismissive. And it's particularly dismissive of the role that those sorts of policies have had in driving down the costs of those technologies. And we've always got to remember that, yes, there is, the cost of manufacture or production, and that can happen locally or globally, but there's the skills and the supply chains and the ecosystem and the comfort with a particular technology in the market that gets driven by deployment programs that you're not necessarily going to get with a economy-wide carbon price. It is not an either-or. And you can't have a specific policy for every little boondoggle, but there are certain areas where it makes a hell of a lot of sense. Anyway, shall we get into their recommendations on the safeguard mechanism, which was quite bold, I thought, and I'm sure that our friends in Canberra furiously negotiating a very significant reform package for the safeguard mechanism as it currently exists, will be pleased that the Productivity Commission is already putting to-dos on their list for 2026, 2027, what they should be doing next.
Yeah.
I will be as confident as the PC are by saying that everything with the safeguard mechanism negotiations was successfully concluded after we record this episode. But before you hear it, dear listener, it was all fine. And Luke, you can leave that in as a marker of my prescience or folly. Mm-hmm. But I think prescience.
Yeah. If I was to guess, I would say that something's going to get across the line. But we shall see. All
right. So they need an economy-wide carbon price to be the thing that does the heavy lifting for everything, just about everything. And they reckon that with a nip and a tuck and a wholesale Frankensteinian operation here or there, that you can turn the safeguard mechanism into that thing. And the short version of what they want to do is to broaden it out by making it apply to smaller facilities, 25 kilotons rather than 100 kilotons. They want it to apply to emissions that are from electricity and from transport. And they want to credit abatement below the threshold. Oh, and of course, they want it to not contain any additional measures to address carbon leakage or competitiveness or ET or whatever you like to call that complex of issues. And so you put all those things together and they reckon that is near enough is good enough to an economy-wide price that enables you to junk RETs and maybe energy efficiency schemes and certainly EV demand support policy. And there's a lot to unpack in every one of those bits. But per my statement up the front, I think some of the recommendations for action are more convincing than the rationales for them.
They also don't like intensity-based baselines.
Right. They want to go to fixed
only. Baselines. Yep.
Yep. Good point.
So you're the teacher at school marking the homework saying, well, you got to the right answer, but your workings are terrible. Don't make that sense.
Yes. I think that's right.
D. Okay.
But I might borrow the paper as a template for a few reforms in 3 to 4 years' time.
Well, I mean, where do you want to start? Give me an example of a good idea that was poorly justified.
Okay, so they want to bring electricity into this thing. This is a complex of ideas that have good elements and add up to a bad thing. They want to bring electricity into the thing so that we can drive abatement across multiple sectors with one price signal. And they want to credit with these absolute baselines and sub-threshold crediting. They want facilities that close to be able to cash out their baselines, to sell off these absolute baselines to others as this is a way of incentivising facilities that ought to close instead of this sort of light touch, kid gloves approach of emissions intensity.
It's like a carbon handshake.
Absolutely. But the result of that carbon handshake, the way they describe it, they don't put these pieces together, but it sounds very much like you would need to have much faster decline rates in baselines if you're trying to get one mechanism to do the 82%, the equivalent of the 82% renewables in the electricity sector that the government is banking on, and the 43% off 2020-ish task that it's expecting the safeguard to do for industry and resources. So the combination of those things is going to have to go down much faster, and it's going to result in much faster reduction in baselines for industry and resources, and they're going to be paying coal-fired power stations to close, which they are going to do anyway. It's going to be a big cash out. And when you combine it with their recommendation that the capacity investment scheme in the electricity sector be broadened out to be technology neutral, coal-fired power stations that don't close will get paid to not close through the capacity investment scheme, and those that do close will get paid to do so by heavy industry and resources. And I'm not sure what problem we're solving there, because the closure dates are announced. So I think having an electricity development of the safeguard, or even some other policy that guarantees emissions reductions in the electricity sector, it's not crazy of the PC to warn, well, who knows, trends look good, or emissions reductions are going to happen right now, but who knows, price relativities could change, coal and gas could get really cheap when a lot of people aren't buying them.
I thought that was a good insight.
Yeah, have a backstop.
Yep.
Sure. Their specific backstop needs a lot more thought than appears to have been put into the interaction of all these parts.
Well, what did you all make of the proposed expansion to the transport sector? Because, they make the point that only some elements of the sector, like really large facilities, like large rail companies or airlines, are currently captured, and they correctly make the point that, well, one, our transport emissions have increased over the last couple of decades. I think it was sort of less than 10% of our emissions, as a proportion, in 1990, and it's close to double that in 2021. And a lot of that is from individual cars, buses and trucks, and their Scope 1 emissions from burning all that fuel. So their proposal here with respect to the safeguard mechanism is that, if we're capturing the electricity sector, you're sort of capturing the EV industry because of the upstream impacts on the generators. But they're then sort of suggesting that the downstream Scope 1 emissions from combustion vehicles should be included by having the upstream fuel wholesalers included as well.
Yeah, you could do it. Mechanically you could do it and it wouldn't be that hard. They could have gone a bit further and proposed doing the same thing for just natural gas and all fuels. Although natural gas would get a bit more complicated with, some large buyers also being covered by the safeguard, and you need to get into obligation transfer certificate type mechanical stuff, which is a bit more in the weeds than this report is. But I don't think it's bad. But how much of the transport transition problem does it solve? I think a lot of that problem still requires you either to do a bunch of things on networks for charging, on regulatory reform, around time of use pricing and education, and then heavy transport, I think, takes you to a world of the thing that PC doesn't see the point of, which is spending money on things that are more expensive so that they get cheaper with experience. Great big trucks and zero emissions aircraft and shipping, those things are not going to be propelled anytime soon by a lowest common denominator carbon price. And yet, per the IPCC earlier, Like, there's not a lot of time to muck around waiting for things to happen. You've got to get going on all fronts pretty fast.
So, to summarise, they want to cover the electricity sector, but as we know, the electricity sector is on a rapid decarbonisation trajectory anyway, just because of, the long-lived facilities ageing out and the cost of new generation capacity, so very much favouring these new renewable technologies and storage and the like. Transport sector, look, you could do it, as you say, but there's a bunch of other stuff that you need to do as well. There's also a recommendation, as you said, Tenant, for lowering facility thresholds. The current threshold for coverage by the safeguard is 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. That gives you a bit over 200 facilities. You lower it to 25,000 tonnes and you get another 300 facilities, but only another 3% of Australian emissions covered. They go through some of the arguments for and against that. They note that it's not a lot of extra emissions, but it would mean that facilities that reduce their emissions significantly below 100,000 tonnes are still covered by the safeguard, so they don't drop out of that. It means that, you don't have carbon leakage within Australia of production being moved towards more carbon-intensive facilities within Australia that are just smaller and not covered by the safeguard. So there's some arguments there.
Are you making the carbon leakage segue to
what I am, but what I wanted to say was, like, there is a sense in which they want to expand the safeguard to other sectors because it's an elegant solution to what they wanted and what they're back solving for, which is an economy-wide carbon price, rather than going sector by sector and saying, well, is this the most effective policy in this particular context? I am not convinced, to be honest, and maybe there is a version of this where it would make sense, but I'm not sure that the one that they've outlined here does make a huge amount of sense in each case. It's kind of like they've taken a first principles approach of saying, well, we would like to do this, what is the argument for it, rather than actually, engaging in a robust way with the facts on the ground in each of these spaces. I mean, I could provide Tennant with his segue to carbon border adjustments, but I mainly wanted to provide him with some sympathy because I saw that the Productivity Commission presented an ironclad case that an Australian CBAM is entirely unnecessary because free sub-baseline emissions in the safeguard mechanism are so generous, carbon leakage isn't a concern.
You're just trolling me. And so are they.
See being wound up. Unleash.
All right. So the PC considers the arguments around carbon leakage, and they present some reasons to think that, maybe that theory is overstated. But they basically go down a thought process that says, well, the way most countries have dealt that have any climate policy at all, and certainly a carbon price, deal with carbon leakage is they do free allocation of a high share of emissions rights. That's what Australia used to do. It's what Europe has been doing. Lots of others have done it. And the baselines in the safeguard mechanism, the allowable emissions below which you won't be facing any kind of obligation or cost on your emissions, they are mathematically equivalent to free allocation. And therefore that's a heaping whack of assistance, except it's not just trade-exposed industries, it's everybody getting it. And if you do the numbers, it's more generous by this point than the old carbon pricing mechanism free allocation would have been. So, that's it, job done on competitiveness. And there's a lot in that argument. Give them their due. It is true that this is very substantial assistance. It's also true that they hate that assistance. They would like to see that assistance go away. And it does go away as the baselines drop, and they drop pretty rapidly in the government's view. What the PC doesn't really engage with is what happens after that. They simply say, because you've got this, you don't need anything else, and including you don't need an Australian CBAM. They're also arguing against like other stuff, TIBA and special funds and things. But they say in like 1.5 sentences, no, you got this thing, so you don't need a CBAM, which would just add to costs, be protection, something. And I am issuing a cry from the heart to the Productivity Commission.
who are definitely still listening at this point of the podcast.
Well, maybe we can just send an edited transcript of just this part of the episode, because some further examination of the nature of carbon border adjustment mechanisms is going to reveal to the Productivity Commission that they love them, that a carbon border adjustment mechanism is the pathway to realise some of the PC's fondest hopes and dreams, including points that are made in this paper and not quite followed through on. So what do I mean by that? A critical aspect of carbon border adjustment mechanisms is that they, if properly implemented in a WTO consistent fashion, they provide a level playing field, which means a consumer in a country levying a CBAM on, say, steel, can't find anybody to buy steel from who isn't facing a carbon cost on the carbon embodied in that steel. And that means a few things. It means that the carbon price has a lot more traction on consumer decisions, which is something the PC cites higher up as a good thing about carbon prices. And, you know, it can be a politically controversial thing, but it is not functional. That traction on consumer choices doesn't exist when the unevenness between national and international climate policies creates a situation where carbon-intensive manufacturers or suppliers can't put carbon prices into their selling prices at all, because they will be wiped out by competitors who don't have that cost. So you get a more effective, more efficient carbon price, more traction in the real economy. You also enable the faster, if you have a CBAM, you enable the faster removal, not just enable, you need to do the faster removal of the free allocation. The European Union has been doing free allocation. They can't sustain that free allocation. It's very expensive to keep doing it while your targets keep getting deeper. And so CBAM is enabling them to meet their need for continued competitiveness and investability in zero emissions production without these effectively fiscal budget and carbon budget money vomiting subsidies. So the PC should be very enthusiastic about a reform that enables the better use of public resources and gets a more efficient carbon price working in the economy. And so, you know, they may not love CBAM today, but CBAM loves them.
CBAM loves us all, Tennant.
I think, like, by avoiding talking about Tennant's CBAM paper on an episode, we're ensuring that we talk about it in every episode.
Look, it's a very good paper, but I would be self-dealing if I said more. There's a lot more that could be said about many parts of this, and I'm not gonna. The appendix on calculating abatement costs, full of rubbish, so noteworthy. Not going to talk about it.
Oof.
It's bad. That's all I'll say.
So, is it fair to say we're not recommending this paper to our listeners?
I mean, there's some good stuff in there, but I think I liked Tennant's sort of summation on there. Like, if you looked at the recommendations in isolation, I think you'd walk away with it with a better opinion of it, rather than dwelling too long on their rationale for why they recommend certain things.
I think if the logic of this paper had been followed 10, 15, 20 years ago, solar PV and wind power would still be hundreds of dollars a megawatt hour. Like we would be nowheresville if this was all we had listened to. And it's no reason to think it's a better guide today for the next wave of mitigation technologies that we need to start unlocking.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. And I think I'm right in saying, Tennant, that it's all New South Wales. One more thing. Zzz.
The day in the sun of little-known backwater New South Wales has finally come. They're in the discourse. Well done. Well done, little state.
The token New South Welshman's going to reserve my comments for later.
What have you got?
All right. So I wish to sing the praises of a pretty interesting guideline issued by the New South Wales Treasury, TPG 23/08, New South Wales Government Guide to Cost-Benefit Analysis. It sounds like the driest thing in the universe, but these are rules that every government agency has to follow when they're making new policy proposals for project investment or new regulations. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but the big thing is a rethink on how they treat climate change. There's a lot of argument in there and still some problems. But where they get to is that carbon, until something better comes along, carbon has to be valued in New South Wales government cost-benefit analysis by reference to spot prices in the European Union emissions trading scheme, which the last time I checked equated to about 140 Australian dollars per tonne. And that is quite a price and will make quite a substantial difference to how different projects and different policies stack up when the New South Wales government is considering them. This is the kind of engine room, in the weeds stuff that is actually very important, but so obtuse that it is outside the knowledge or ability to remain conscious of everybody who doesn't have to follow it as part of their work. But it was pretty interesting.
But Tennant, would the Productivity Commission like it?
You know, I think they should have a read of it. They should consider what they think about some of the issues in there. Because they put a lot of weight on cost-benefit analysis. I think the PC would say we've got a different economy to Europe's, and we should have our own economy-wide price and then use that one as the reference point. But also they would say we should internationally link to other economies, maybe including the European Union one. So I don't know. But I do know that a honking big carbon price is going to be used to weigh up a whole lot of policy in New South Wales, and it'll make a difference.
That's super interesting. Do they have things to say about learning rates and discount rates?
So they don't consider learning rates, really. They do talk about, how do you inflate carbon costs over time if you're taking a point number now from a market, and they say, it's a bit tricky. Let's go with 2.25% because that's the mid-range of some different estimates that we saw from the literature. You know, there's a lot of theoretical arguments to have about where they get to. They consider social costs of carbon and they conclude that they're a bit rubbish, which is fair. But where they come out, though, it's a very pragmatic approach. You know, they've got this history going long now, but New South Wales up until last year was saying in different sorts, like decisions by planning authorities, which won't necessarily be changed by this guidance. I'm really not sure of that. But they were saying, you can only consider the carbon costs associated with the portion of the harm of emissions that takes place from New South Wales that takes place in New South Wales, which is a very small fraction of global damages from emissions. And this paper just discounts that as far as the logic is concerned when applied to New South Wales government activity. But they're still focused on emissions produced inside New South Wales, but they say, look, building materials and things for theoretically unjustifiable but pragmatically very sensible reasons, let's count those embodied emissions as if they took place in New South Wales for the purposes of evaluating like infrastructure investments and so on. So it works okay in practice, but how will it work in theory is a question that does not appear to trouble them, and good on them. Go for it, New South Wales Treasury.
Those kinds of documents are highly influential when it comes to the formation of public policy, so it'd be very interesting to see what happens there.
All right. Well, that's a good summation of a recent win by the outgoing New South Wales government. Frankie, what have you got?
A little bit of a PSA. Well, it won't be by the time you lovely folks are listening to this.
It's fresh for us.
It's fresh. On the incoming New South Wales government, which will be of a different colour. So at this point in time, we know that the New South Wales Labor Party has enough seats to form a government in the lower house. The upper house is always a little bit more complex in New South Wales, and it's been a long time since any party had a majority there, so you can expect there to be a crossbench of some size. I thought I would comment then on what we might expect from the first Labor government in 12 years in the state of New South Wales, and their election platform centred on a few big, bold commitments and not a lot of detail outside of those. The first one is well, kind of seems to be a little reminiscent of Victoria reviving their own State Electricity Commission.
I think that one's stealing federal policy a little more. Like it's a mini CEFC.
A little more.
But with a focused mandate.
Yeah, that's kind of how I read it. Yeah, very focused. Okay, so I'm bearing the lead here. So they've committed to creating the New South Wales Energy Security Commission, so to be the state-owned body to accelerate investment in renewable energy assets. But it'll be seeded with $1 billion from their existing Restart New South Wales fund. Importantly, though, and to Janet's point, it does have a focused, it would have a focused mandate on the sort of medium to long-term storage solution investments needed, like pumped hydro or technology for grid stability. And it sort of notes the reason, I think, for making that commitment is the views of various stakeholders. The outgoing coalition government's policy around renewable energy zones had set a target for 2 gigawatts of storage by 2030, and there were some fears that that wasn't going to be met without additional kind of policy drivers there. So that's one big commitment. The second one is to legislate emissions reduction targets, also taking inspo, I think, from both the feds and Victoria, who have done that. So they'd be legislating for net zero by 2050 and a 50% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. And so I think, this leaves room for them to go even more ambitious or, sort of seek alignment there with much higher targets on the 2035 mark. But they didn't make any formal commitments on that time horizon. And the last one I mentioned is the establishment of a net zero commission. So the idea of having an independent body to monitor progress against those targets, provide advice on impacts to jobs in industry and energy prices and things like that. It would also be tasked, this commission, with developing the big hairy plan for net zero by 2050 for the state, and they also have a mandate to update that every 5 years, which is funny because you're electing a government for a 4-year term, so who knows? It will do at least one of these things, and if it continues beyond the next election cycle, it can do more. Great to see some commitment to, embedding targets and looking at those sort of frameworks. I guess it's a bit sketchy on anything more detailed outside of the energy transition, which seems to be the way that governments in recent years have framed their election commitments. So it looks like a good grounding to do more, and I'd hope to see them, expand their ambition into other sectors of the economy, because referring to the report we chatted about at the top of the episode, we need to go hard now across the whole economy, not just the energy sector.
As Antonio Guterres said last week as we record, everything, everywhere, all at once.
Absolutely.
If we could get some help from Michelle Yeoh, that would be great.
That would be awesome. All right, I'm going to round out this tripartite New South Wales one more thing by giving a shout out to Matt Kean, outgoing Treasurer, Energy Minister, Climate Minister, and a man who today announced he won't contest the leadership of the Parliamentary Liberal Party, although he says he intends to serve out his term. Climate change is an issue that can become incredibly muddy when it gets caught up in partisan politics, and as I think we talk about a lot, dealing with it effectively requires big structural changes to our economy, and they are really easy to demagogue. And Matt Kean, to his great credit, took a different path, framing the transition in terms of economic opportunity and leading into the challenge and explaining the pathway ahead to voters. And while he is by no means the only person on the right side of politics to champion climate action, he is by almost any measure the most effective, and amidst the policy legacy, which is significant, is a bit of a case study for how a right-of-centre party can engage in the climate debate in a really positive way, and that is so crucial for building a durable consensus right across the community for this huge transformation of our economy. So I just wanted to acknowledge that contribution. It would be a very significant legacy. I would be kind of surprised if it's the last we hear of Matt Kean, but he could hang up his spurs, having made a very significant contribution to the Australian climate debate.
Indeed.
Yeah.
At one point, the National Cabinet, the Federal Cabinet, was said to be unaware of who Matt Kean was, but that's a situation that cannot have lasted for very long.
No. And I think it was sort of worth noting, because I think, now with New South Wales going to a Labor government, that's every government around the country except for Tassie. But I think one of the things that really marked his term in that portfolio was really a mature approach to bipartisanship and engagement with his colleagues from around the country, which I think he deserves and got a lot of credit for.
All right. Well, that is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reid.
And my handle is at Luke Menzel. Frankie, what's our email address and what should people be doing with it?
You should be sending all your hot tips for papers that are hopefully less than 600 pages for us to read to mailbag@letmesumup.net. And also, if you have free advice or thoughts on our previous musings, we're always here for that too.
That would be awesome. And Tennant, if someone was to look us up on the internet, what website should they be tracking down?
www.letmesumup.net is what you need to fire into your series of tubes to locate our website.
Yes, indeed. And there you'll find a full back catalogue of episodes and links to all the things we talked about today. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
I was sort of hoping that there was going to be some disagreement of the PC with Andrew McIntosh, so that we could have called this episode PC versus Mac, the next generation. But it was not to be.
I'm a Mac. I'm a PC. We disagree about AQs.
But we're both economists. Well, no. One is a lawyer and one is an economist.